Updated November 10, 2017 101,140. It was a short, bumpy and occasionally sad road into the aviation history books. The plane kept crashing and the money dried up, but for just over a year in 1915, three Kalgoorlie engineering students designed and built Western Australia's first powered aircraft from scratch. Paul Jenge, Roy Burton and Walter Peters were studying mechanical engineering at the Western Australian School of Mines WASM in 1912 when they met and bonded over a shared love of motorcycles. Curtin University archivist Elizabeth Mackenzie said the students' thoughts quickly turned to aviation, which had been capturing the imaginations across the globe after Orville and Wilbur Wright's groundbreaking 12-second flight in 1903. Aviation was very much in its infancy around the world, so there were people building planes and experimenting with aviation in the eastern states, but not to any large degree. Mrs. Mackenzie said this feat just shows the determination and innovation these lads in Kalgoorlie had at their fingertips. The students were eventually joined by Jack Gear, a British pilot who had wound up in the goldfields, who held the distinction of being was only licensed pilot at the time. Test flight finishes with two separate crashes tapping sources around the gold mining community for funds. The group eventually grew to 20. The group approached the British War Office for designs, something the British government, in the middle of an unprecedented arms race with Germany, was only too happy to provide. Building off a modified design drawn up by Jenge, they unveiled the aircraft's frame on April 26, 1915, to a crowd of 300 people at Kalgoorlie's town hall. Almost no one in the crowd had seen an aeroplane before. A successful 40 kilometers flight from Kalgoorlie to Coolgardie followed, where Gear landed the plane on the town's main street to the astonishment of shoppers and pub patrons. The return flight, in June 1915, did not end so successfully. The engine failed and the plane came down on its nose, Mrs. Mackenzie said. Amazingly, Gear escaped uninjured, with the plane's propeller the only component damaged. If the wasn't enough to have it towed back to Kalgoorlie, they had to put it on some kind of wagon, Mrs. Mackenzie said. Unfortunately, the horses who were towing the wagon were spooked by something, and the plane ended up against a telegraph pole. Panicked passenger. Another hiccup. Plane next took to the skies in October after a 4-month rebuild, although the flight ended in similarly bizarre fashion. Auctioning a flight to a lady passenger in a bid to raise funds for the repairs, Gear took off from the Kalgoorlie racecourse with 17-year-old Florence Brown on board. Flying high above the racecourse, reports of the occasion suggest Miss Brown began to panic after the plane was hit by a strong gust of wind. She tried to stand up and get out of the plane in mid-air, Mrs. Mackenzie said. Jack Gear had to land the plane while holding her down, and steer the plane to a safe landing on the course at the same time. He managed to do both, but not before crashing the plane into the fence and causing further damage. Costs. Damage eventually grounded plane. The aircraft eventually made it to Perth after further repairs, but it was the beginning of the end for the syndicate. Increasing costs and decreasing interest from the public drained the group's money, while engine damage eventually forced the plane into mothballs in 1916. Many of the syndicate members went on to military careers, with Gear and Roy Burton serving as pilots in the Australian Imperial Force. Walter Peters worked as a gun manufacturer in England, before eventually returning to Perth. But sadly, Paul Jenge, whose design work effectively kick-started the project, was killed in a car accident after returning to Sydney in 1917. The plane itself wound up in the War Museum, but does not survive to the present day. Present-day WASM director Sam Spearing said he hoped the little-known story would serve as inspiration for his students. I think it's amazing, Dr. Spearing said. They did it on a shoestring, with very few resources, and they just persisted. I think it's a wonderful story. Topics: History. Air Transport. Air Force, Kalgoorlie 6430, Perth 6000. First posted November 10, 2017. 081351.